Which of these lenses is better for portraits? Let's talk about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Today's question comes from Abhinav M. So sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but I do thank you for sending this question. Hey David, I'm thinking about doing some portraiture and need lens advice. Which one will give a better result? An 85mm with a large 1.4 aperture, or a 70-200 at 2.8 with the longer focal length? Thanks. Now before we can answer that, we have to define what we even mean by a better portrait lens. Obviously, that's a subjective term, but there are some things that are generally accepted as being the most pleasing when photographing people. For example, longer focal lengths tend to be more flattering. It keeps the perspective looking natural and doesn't distort facial features like a wide-angle lens might do. In my old Adorama series called 2-Minute Tips, I did a video about why different focal lengths affect facial features, and it might not be for the reasons you expect. I'll put a link to that in the description below if you want to check it out later. Now, both of the lenses we're talking about today are considered to be good focal lengths for portraits, so there's really no issues there. But another important consideration is depth of field. See, when you focus on something like someone's eyes, there's an area of space in front of and behind them that's considered to be in focus or acceptably sharp. That just means it might not be razor sharp, but it still looks sharp enough to your eye in the final image. Now that area, it gets thicker or thinner depending on your lens's aperture setting. That's how wide that lens opens up when you take a picture. Smaller openings, which are the bigger numbers like f11, f16, f22, and on, they give you a wider depth of field, so you're going to see more detail in the background of your photos. And bigger lens openings like 1.4 or 2.8 make that slice of focus much thinner, so your foreground and background are going to be more out of focus. Now, the quality of that out-of-focus background is pretentiously called bokeh, which is a Japanese word that means blur. It's actually a big part of what makes portraits stand out. If you have a smooth, creamy background from a shallow depth of field, your subject almost seems to jump right out of the frame. That's because there's less distracting detail in the background to pull your eye away. Now, there's a whole world of physics and perception behind how our eyes process the stuff, and there's an actual mathematical formula to calculate depth of field. And believe it or not, that's just the simplified version. Here's the full equation that separates depth of field into near and far limits using the hyperfocal distance, as one does. Now, you are more than welcome to go down the deep rabbit hole of acceptable sharpness and the circle of confusion. But the bottom line is that the wider your aperture, the more the background is going to blur, and that's generally considered to be more pleasing. Hey, before I go on, if you're getting something out of these videos, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to Adorama's YouTube channel, and go ahead and hit that bell icon for notifications. It really does help us out and lets us keep producing free educational content for you every single week. And remember, as you probably know, if you've got a photography question of your own, just head over to askdavidbergman.com, fill out the form on that site, and I just might pick your question and answer here on a future episode. Okay, so with everything we know so far, it seems obvious that the 85mm prime lens at 1.4 is going to be better for portraits than the 70-200 because that only goes to 2.8, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out that aperture isn't the only thing that affects depth of field. Focal length is also a big one. See, the more that you zoom in, the more compressed the background becomes, making it more blurred. So here's the big question. On one hand, we've got the 85 with that wide 1.4 aperture, and on the other, the 70-200 can zoom all the way to 200 millimeters. Which one is going to give us more blur? Well, to find out, earlier today, I took my friend Bergman into Central Park and I made some portraits. I used my Canon R1 body for all of the images you're going to see here today. Now, Canon does have a brand new 85 1.4 hybrid lens, and it is a beauty. I recently did a video about hybrid lenses, and I'll link to that below if you want to see what makes them special. But that lens is so new, I don't actually have one yet. So for this shoot, I use this. This is the 85 1.2, and I just went ahead and set the aperture to 1.4 to match. So we're going to pretend this is a 1.4 lens. Now for the 70-200, I use this. This is Canon's newest USM Z lens. You can get it in white or black. I like the black version because it's better to stay a bit more hidden when I'm photographing concerts. Can't see me at all, right, with this black lens? Yeah. Okay. So here's Brogan with the 85mm at 1.4. I'm standing about 5.5 feet away from her. Look at that background. It's beautiful, right? Smooth and creamy like butter. Just what you'd expect to come out of this lens. Now, when I go ahead and switch to the 7200 and I zoom all the way to 200mm, there's an obvious problem. I'm way too close now. To really do a genuine comparison, I want to match the framing on both shots, so I do have to back up a bit. Now I'm about 13 feet away from her and I've got the same composition. The background is still super smooth and it looks great, definitely portrait worthy. So let's compare the two. Side by side, the 85 has a slightly shallower depth of field. The background blur is just a bit softer with less detail. But the 7200 holds its own and still works really well. Now remember when I said there are other factors that affect depth of field besides just aperture? Well, we talked about focal length, but the third one is distance to the background. If Brogan's standing right in front of a tree, maybe just a foot or two away, the 85 looks much smoother than the 200 after I compensate for distance. But if I want to get more blur from that 7200, I can move her so the background is much further away. That distance gives me better separation from the background, and both lenses now provide a nice soft bokeh. As we already discovered, the 85 is going to be a bit more shallow, but the 200 works really well at that distance. So besides that, let's see what other things might make a difference when you're trying to decide between these two lenses. Each one does have some practical pros and cons. First, the 85mm. Now, a prime lens doesn't zoom, so it has fewer moving parts and glass elements as well, making it smaller and lighter than a comparable zoom lens. It's generally easier to carry, fits better in your camera bag, and is usually less expensive. But since it doesn't zoom, you have to zoom with your feet to adjust your framing. You're locked into that 85mm field of view unless you physically get closer or back up. That might not be a big deal, but it just depends on your style. A lot of photographers do love fast prime lenses, and not just for portraits. You can use them for detail shots, street photography, even concerts or events in low light, but they're just not as versatile as zoom lenses. Now, the 7200. Canon has made several versions of that lens over the years. I used the older EF one for a long time before switching to the first RF model when I went mirrorless. I'm currently using that 7200 VCM Z lens, and it is the sharpest 7200 I've ever seen, even with a teleconverter. But whatever brand or model you have, a zoom lens in that focal range is way more versatile than any prime lens. Yes, you can absolutely use it for portraits, but it also works great for sports, events, concerts, wildlife, and a whole bunch of other things. You can shoot tight or wide without changing lenses, and that flexibility is huge when you're on the move. Now, of course, you're going to pay for that versatility. This particular 7200 costs about twice as much as the 85 1.4 hybrid. It's also heavier and takes up more space in your camera bag, although the other RF version is smaller and lighter. Still, it's something to think about if you're traveling light or shooting all day. Another thing to consider is your environment. To take advantage of that shallow depth of field at 200mm, you have to back up. That means you need space. If you're working in a small studio or a tight location, that might not be practical. So what's the bottom line here? Well, if your number one priority is getting the absolute shallowest depth of field possible for a creamy, dreamy portrait, the 85 1.4 is hard to beat. It's compact, fast, and gives you amazing background blur. But if you want more versatility and have the budget and the space, the 70-200 2.8 is one of the most useful lenses you can own. It still helps you make beautiful portraits, and it's a workhorse for almost every type of photography. Both lenses are great, and you really can't go wrong either way. So my suggestion, just get them both. What do you all think? What lenses do you use for portraits? Let me know down in the comments below, and we'll talk about it. And if you want a refresher about aperture and how it works for depth of field and exposure, check out this video I did that should help you there. Thanks so much for watching Adorama TV, and I'll see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.